During the height of the civil rights movement, the Methodist minister, Dr. James Wallace Hamilton, once famously asked during a sermon, "Can Christianity survive in a world where the powerful forces run counter to it?" Today, I ask a variation of that same question. Does Christianity have a chance in a world where so many seek to claim Christ in the service of their own bigotries? Dr. James Wallace Hamilton wrote these words primarily directed at his white and privileged Methodist congregation. These are the same people that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. directed his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he challenged how white moderate Christians lived out their faith and how so many of them were unable to see the inequities and how Christianity was being distorted daily around them. Not much different from today, where there are folks who claim Christ, who claim to be washed by the blood of the Lamb, and they look around the world and they don't realize how Christianity is being used to oppress, to marginalize, and to erase people from history. How Christianity is being used in this nation to promote white xenophobia, Christian nationalism, homophobia, racism, misogyny, all forms of isms that seek to deny the basic human dignity of our fellow human beings. Hi, I'm Terrance Carroll. I'm an ordained Baptist preacher, a public theologian, a lawyer, and the former Speaker of the Colorado House of Representatives. Faithful Witness is grounded in the prophetic tradition of the Black church, and each week we explore the moral questions shaping our society, our culture, and our democracy. Thanks for taking time to watch, and I hope that you enjoy this week's episode. Recently, I finished a book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. Before I go any further, I want to assure you that I'm actually not predicting or prophesying that this nation is headed down a one-way track to a civil war. What I do want to talk about briefly is that we do appear to have a theological crisis in this nation, not just a theological crisis as it relates to Christians, but a theological crisis that's broader as well. A theological crisis about what does it mean to be American, a theological crisis about who is American, and a theological crisis about how do we relate to each other and as Americans in this multicultural and pluralistic society. And you may be asking, what does this have to do with theology? Well, there's this thing called American civic religion that's been talked about by sociologists for a long time, made famous by the sociologist named Robert Bellah, who I've talked about briefly on this podcast before. The foundation of American civic religion, first and foremost, is the Declaration of Independence as the sacred text of American democracy, especially that middle part of the Declaration of Independence, where it talks about that all men are created equal, and and it should say really, if I were to rewrite it today, I would say all folks are created equal, and that we're endowed with certain unalienable rights. Among those is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Many regard that as a sacred text because it lays down what our fundamental belief is. And that is, first and foremost, we're all created equal. There are no caveats to that. There's no fine print to that. We are all created equal in this democracy. And if we want to connect this to the basic tenets of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, that goes back to Genesis 1. God created us in God's image. In other words, we are all image bearers, each and every one of us. Not one of us is greater than the other, and not one of us is lesser than the others. That brings us back to our theological crisis. If we believe that the foundational document of American civic faith is the Declaration of Independence, we're in a theological crisis because it appears that in our government and the people who control the levers of government no longer believe, clearly no longer believe, that we're all created equal. They're trying to create categories within our nation of who's better and who's less than someone else, who deserves more rights and who deserves less rights, whose history is more valuable and whose history should be erased. Just look at what this administration has been up to in that regard. Pete Hegseth single-handedly has been attempting to erase the presence of all women and all Black and brown folks, especially Black folks, out of the Pentagon and out of the officer corps of the United States military. One of the militaries in the world that is probably the most diverse and has for years seen it as their superpower, that this military of ours represents the broad range of people who live in the United States of America. But now this white Christian nationalism of Pete Hegseth is undermining our military. That's probably the most visible example of how we're in a theological crisis. This belief that there's some folks who live in this country, folks who look like me, for instance, question whether we have earned our credentials and our accolades. There's a scarlet letter DEI, or the scarlet word woke, that's been placed upon us because there are folks who fundamentally don't believe that each of us in this democracy, each of us who are live within the boundaries of the United States of America, are fundamentally created equal. And if you don't believe that all of us are created equal, you're going to end up with public policy that considers cruelty to be a norm, that considers bigotry to be the status quo, that considers all the hateful isms to be the appropriate way of doing business. And it becomes worse when you do it, when it's done under the banner of Christianity. And if you don't know who Doug Wilson is, I've talked about him before, but I'll keep talking about him again. He is Pete Hegseth's pastor and the founder of a group of churches who are Christian nationalists in nature, who believe that women shouldn't vote, who question whether slavery was a bad thing or not, who ministers have said that young Black men should be strung up like in the Old Testament and beat to death through stoning because young Black men are most likely to get into crime. The same people that have also said that Black Christians are heretical and aren't being taught correctly, and that every member of a Black church should be forced to go sit under and supervise by a white pastor. These are also the same people whose Christianity is very performative by my estimation. And I want to be clear, I'm never going to say that they're not Christian. But I will always say that we as Christians should be known, as Jesus said, by our love. And we as Christians should produce fruit of the Spirit. If you want to know what the fruit of the Spirit is, it's listed in Galatians 5. It's love, kindness, self-control, patience, on and on and on. The role of the Christian in the democratic marketplace is to engage with others in that marketplace to find points of commonality so that we can improve the common good for each and every person who live within the boundaries of this great democracy. Our role, in my humble opinion, as people of faith, is not to impose our worldview on others. Our role is not to pass laws so that we can make everyone else think, believe, and act as we do as people of faith, as Christians in particular, which would beg the question of which tenets of Christianity are normative for all Christians. I think there's a basic definition of what it means to be a person who believes in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I always, when I close my sermons and I open the doors of the church, so to speak, as we say in the Black Baptist Church, I say that it's actually pretty simple to express your faith in Christ, because all it requires is that you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that Jesus Christ walked this earth, that Jesus Christ was hung on the cross, crucified, he died, and on the third day he was resurrected, and that you believe that because of that sacrifice of Jesus Christ, if you simply accept Jesus into your heart and believe it sincerely, that you will have salvation. That's the baseline. Part of why Christianity, and I asked today in the words of Reverend Dr. Hamilton, does Christianity have a chance, is because the practice of Christianity by some has become more consumed by defining who's outside the faith than by trying to include people within the faith by going out with love and expressing the love of Jesus Christ to those people so that they may be saved. And for the sake of argument, if you want to say that there's a certain category of people who, and don't get me wrong here, let me back up for a second. Sin is a real thing. People sin. People do horrible things in this world. And those people should be called out for their sin. But that rebuke should also be done in love. No matter the reason for that rebuke should be done in love. Because no one's going to care what you have to say to them if they don't think that you genuinely care about them as a human being. And if every time you open your mouth about that person, you lead with, you're going to hell, that you're the worst thing in the world today, that the way you live or the way you think is absolutely awful and you're an awful person because you do things like this, they're never going to hear the love of Jesus Christ, at least as it comes out of your mouth. Take, for example, what's happening in Texas right now. There seems to be a run on religious xenophobia in certain local governments in Texas, county commissions and the like, who are running all over each other to pass anti-Sharia law bills. They want to ban Sharia law in Texas because the Texas Muslim population is growing. They've decided that these Muslims the bulk of whom, most of whom, almost all of whom are U.S. citizens who just happen to be Muslim, want to build mosques. They want to be able to worship their God in the manner in which they're accustomed. But this is fearful to some people. And they've decided, since Texas is a Christian state, that they want to make sure that Texas stays Christian. First of all, there's no state that's Christian. We don't impose religious tests. But this is the problem with Christian nationalism, is that it excludes others. It does not believe in a functioning democratic marketplace that is inclusive of all voices. For Christian nationalists, the only credible voices in the democratic marketplaces are Christian voices that represent a very narrow and fundamentalist view of Christianity. This is why we end up with a bill that was just recently upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, again out of Texas, that says that every elementary, high school, and middle school in the state of Texas, every classroom in each of those schools has to display the King James Version of the Ten Commandments. This is classic Christian nationalism, the belief that if we can simply force people to think like us by putting up things like the Ten Commandments, all the problems of the world will be solved. And that's furthest from the truth. And in fact, that's really lazy Christianity, because it says that we don't trust God enough. Let's get down to the brass tacks. It says that we don't trust God enough to transform hearts. So we have to help God out, not by showing love to people, not by being a public witness to folks, but we have to impose our beliefs on others. And for those of us, again, who are Christians, that is so antithetical to how God loves us. God's love was not imposed upon us. Not at all. We were given choice. We were given free will. In Revelation, Jesus says, I knock at the door, and if anyone answers the door, I will enter and I will sup with them and they will sup with me. He didn't say, I'm sending a SWAT team of angels to your door. We're going to kick your door in, throw some flashbangs in, some gas canisters, and we're going to restrain you until you proclaim Jesus Christ is Lord. That's not how it works. But there are folks who still think that's the way we're supposed to do that. And we end up with these false prophets who, because they want to utilize power and they see their faith as a means to exercise power and control over other people, like Jeremiah said, they end up as false prophets peddling false hopes and visions from their own minds. Think about these folks who, Christian leaders, some Christian leaders who bent over backwards and contorted themselves to provide some rationale, some excuse for Donald Trump's Truth Social post a few weeks ago, where he depicted himself as a Messiah-like, Christ-like figure healing people. As an aside, there were no Black people, brown people, any other people who weren't white in that. Maybe it was an oversight. I don't think so, but I'll extend some grace in that area and just say that it was an oversight. You never know, but we'll just assume that it was an oversight. And just this weekend, on the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, we think, or other Trump administration officials at the White House Correspondents Association dinner, the response was not what you would expect uh, after there's been an attempt on the president's life. It's been an excuse to talk about why there needs to be the Trump ballroom on the White House grounds. This ignores the fact that this was not a White House event, but this was the White House Correspondents event, which is a fundraiser for them and their scholarship. So it's not required to be held on the White House grounds, and the president's not required to attend. Most offensively to me, and I can only speak for myself, is Franklin Graham and others in the Magagelical universe now saying that the fact that Donald Trump has survived 3 assassination attempts is a sign that Donald Trump is God's anointed. Again, this causes me to ask, does Christianity stand a chance? Does Christianity stand a chance when we have Christians in this country who are attempting to deify our president, who are attempting to make our president out to be a Christ-like figure? This diminishes the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our evangelical impetus, and I come from a brand of Christianity that believes in evangelism. I believe in evangelism. But that evangelical impulse is not premised on coercion. That evangelical impulse is not premised on the imposition of our beliefs. That evangelical impulse is not premised on the raw use of power to subject others. Never has been, never will be. I want to say one more thing before I close this out. My faith is deeply important to me, and that's why I do this. I wish all people would know Christ like I know Christ. I really do believe, I really want that to be the case. Christ is the number one most important thing. My commitment to Christ and the call that Christ has placed in my life is my most important commitment. I also understand that I follow Christ within the context of the American democratic experiment, which forces me to ask the question always, how do I bear a faithful public witness to Jesus Christ in this marketplace? How do I show up and live in a way that others will ask, what must I do to be saved? That I live in a way where folks will see Christ's love through me. How do I live and how do I participate in the democratic marketplace from that perspective? How do we as Christians continue to give Christianity a chance? And the answer, it's love. And I'll leave you with these words of James Baldwin. Love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together by love and the passion of a very few people. I challenge you to be one of those very few people who holds the world together with love. I challenge you to be one of the very few people who has the passion to show love to others in the world. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. If you like what you've heard or what you saw, do me a favor and help me get this podcast out to more people. Like, subscribe, comment, hit the notification button on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. And remember to tell the truth, seek justice. This is Faithful Witness.